welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're looking at something pretty fundamental, how a society's core values really shape its people.
Mm-hmm.
We're going to use cultural dimensions as our lens for this.
Right. And specifically, we'll be focusing quite a bit on the work of Geert Hofstede. He did this massive study,
The IBM one, right?
Exactly, with IBM employees, across something like 40 countries. And it gave us this really influential model for understanding these cultural differences.
And his approach was etic, wasn't it? Looking for those big cross-cultural patterns.
Precisely. Trying to find those universal dimensions that cultures differ on.
Okay.
And from all that data, Hofstede basically identified 6 key areas or dimensions where cultures tend to show these differences.
6. Okay, what are they?
Well, first you've got power distance. That's basically how much a culture accepts hierarchy and inequality.
Okay.
Then there's the one we'll really dig into. Individualism versus collectivism. Basically how integrated people are into groups. Then uncertainty avoidance, how comfortable a society is with ambiguity, with the unknown.
Makes sense.
Then masculinity versus femininity, which looks at whether a culture values things like competitiveness and achievement more, or cooperation and caring for others.
Interesting distinction.
Yeah. And then long-term versus short-term orientation. Is the focus more on future rewards or on present and past traditions?
Right.
And finally, indulgence versus restraint. So how much does a culture allow people to, satisfy their basic human drives and have fun?
Wow. Okay. So that's quite a comprehensive framework, 6 different dimensions.
Yeah, it really covers a lot of ground, yeah.
And like you said, while they're all fascinating for this deep dive, we're really going to zoom in on one, individualism versus collectivism.
Definitely. Our sources suggest this is a really fundamental difference in how societies are wired.
So let's break that down. What's the core idea?
At its heart, it's about whether the individual or the group is the primary unit of concern.
Yeah.
So in individualistic societies, you tend to see what Hofstede called an I focus. The connections, the ties between people are generally looser.
Right.
The expectation is sort of that you look after yourself and, your immediate family, parents, kids.
So it's a culture that really emphasizes personal goals, personal achievement, independence.
Exactly. And then you flip that coin and you've got collectivist societies. These have more of a we orientation.
A we focus, okay.
Yeah. Here, people are born into strong, cohesive in-groups right from the start. Think extended families, clans, that kind of thing.
And these groups offer support.
Absolutely. Support, protection, belonging. But in return, loyalty to that group is paramount. It's non-negotiable, really.
Okay, so a fundamental difference in focus. How does that actually manifest in day-to-day values?
Well, it ripples out in loads of ways. Our sources list quite a few contrasts. For instance, individualistic cultures often value uniqueness, the drive to be different, to stand out. Whereas collectivist cultures tend to prioritize social harmony. Fitting in, maintaining group cohesion, that's often seen as more important.
That makes a lot of sense. You can sort of picture that, can't you? Like maybe in choosing a job.
Yeah, exactly. In a more individualistic setting, maybe you're encouraged to follow some really unique passion project, even if it's risky.
Right.
But in a more collectivist one, maybe the pressure is towards something more stable, something that benefits the family or the community.
What about communication?
Big differences there, too. Individualistic cultures generally value directness, speaking your mind, being upfront. That's often seen as honest, a virtue.
Okay.
But in many collectivist cultures, communication tends to be more indirect. There's more emphasis on context, on not causing offense, preserving that harmony we talked about. Modesty is often valued over assertiveness.
Right, being careful not to disrupt the group dynamic.
Exactly.
Okay, this is really interesting. How people actually see themselves, their identity. That differs too.
Oh, massively. The sources point out that in individualistic societies, your sense of self, your identity, is often really tied up with your personal achievements. What have you accomplished? What makes you unique?
Defined by the self.
Pretty much. But in collectivist societies, identity is much more about the groups you belong to, your family name, your village, your company. These affiliations define who you are in relation to others.
So less about I achieved this and more about I am part of this.
You got it. Your place within the collective is key.
And that must influence decision-making, right?
Absolutely. Individualistic cultures tend to put a high premium on personal freedom, autonomy, making your own choices, even if they go against the grain.
Whereas in collectivist cultures,
There's often more emphasis on considering the group's well-being. Decisions might be guided more by shared history, traditions, or just what's considered best for us, not just me. Common fate is a bigger factor.
So a different kind of calculation goes into making choices.
A very different calculation, yeah.
And the sources also mention this idea of self-actualization, like reaching your personal potential. That sounds very individualistic.
It is, typically. That drive to fulfill your own unique potential is a strong value in many I cultures.
And the collectivist counterpoint.
It tends to be more about advancing the group's interests. Personal goals might be secondary, or they might be defined in terms of how they benefit the collective.
Okay. What about privacy? That feels like a big one.
Huge difference. In individualistic cultures, the right to privacy, personal space, keeping things confidential, that's usually highly valued. There are expected boundaries, but in many collectivist cultures, there's often a greater sense of shared lives, shared spaces, more interconnectedness. So the expectation of privacy might be much lower, or the concept itself might be understood differently. It's not necessarily seen as a right in the same way.
Right. Less emphasis on that personal bond.
Oh, exactly.
Now, this next point is really fascinating, how rule breaking is viewed.
Yeah, this is interesting. The sources suggest that in individualistic cultures, if you break a rule or violate a norm, the primary feeling is often guilt.
Guilt. So an internal feeling.
Yes, an internal sense of having done wrong, letting yourself down. It can lead to a loss of self-respect. It's about your personal conscience.
Okay. And in collectivist cultures.
The consequence is often shame. And shame is much more external, more social. It's about losing face, not just for yourself, but for your entire in-group, your family, your community.
Losing face. That phrase comes up a lot, especially connected with East Asian cultures.
It does.
Our sources actually pose some questions about this. Like, is this fear of losing face only an Eastern thing? Does it pop up in the West too?
That's a great question. And, while the emphasis on face and the specific ways it's managed might be more explicit or ritualized in some Eastern societies, the underlying human need to maintain social standing, to avoid public embarrassment, well, that seems pretty universal, doesn't it?
I suppose so, yeah. Maybe we just call it different things.
Perhaps. Like in a more individualistic culture, maybe it's less about collective shame and more about avoiding, say, professional failure, public ridicule, or damage to your personal reputation.
So the core motivation protecting your social image might still be there, just framed differently.
I think that's plausible. It definitely makes you think, how could this need not to lose face, whatever form it takes, subtly influence behavior everywhere? Things like maybe being less likely to take risks or finding it harder to admit mistakes publicly.
Yeah, that really connects across cultures, doesn't it? Okay, one last contrast mentioned was self-reliant.
Right. In individualistic societies, being self-reliant, standing on your own 2 feet, that's often held up as a major virtue.
The rugged individual kind of ideal.
Sort of, yeah. Whereas in collectivist societies, interdependence is more the norm. Shared responsibility, relying on the group, contributing to the group, that's just seen as the natural way of life.
Okay, so when you lay it all out like that, wow, it's a really different landscape of values and priorities.
It really is. And that leads us right to the next big question. How does this stuff actually affect how people behave?
Right. Does it translate into actions?
And that's where some classic research, like the Berry study, comes in really handy.
Yes, the conformity study. Our sources spent some time on this one. Berry, 1967, looking specifically at conformity in relation to this dimension. Tell us about it.
Okay, so Berry wanted to see if these cultural orientations, individualistic versus collectivistic, actually correlated with how much people would conform to group pressure.
He used that line judging task, didn't he?
Yeah, he adapted the famous Ash paradigm, the one where you have to match the length of lines. And he looked at 3 quite different cultural groups. First, the Temne people from Sierra Leone. Their society was traditionally based on rice farming, which requires a lot of cooperation tending towards collectivism.
Okay, Temne collectivistic.
Then he studied the Inuit people from Baffin Bay in Canada. Their traditional lifestyle was hunting and fishing activities that often require more individual initiative and self-reliance. So more individualistic.
Individualistic.
Yeah.
Got it.
And then he also included a comparison group, Scots, both urban and rural.
Just as a sort of baseline.
Exactly. And within the Temne and Inuit groups, he did something else interesting. He included people who lived very traditionally with no Western education.
Okay.
And also people who were in transition, meaning they'd had some Western schooling or worked in Westernized jobs.
To see if that exposure changed things.
That was the idea, yeah. He had about 120 people in each main cultural group, so a decent sample size for the time.
Okay, so what did they actually do in the experiment?
Right, so each person was tested one-on-one. They were shown a standard line and then 9 comparison lines. Their job was just to pick the line that matched the standard one in length. Pretty simple.
Sounds straightforward.
They did a couple of practice trials first, just to make sure everyone got it. But then came the twist. On the third trial, the researcher gave them a hint.
A hint.
Yeah, they were told something like, here is a line, and here are the 9 lines. Which one is equal in length? Most Temne or Inuit or Scottish people say this line pointing to a specific line is the correct one. Which one do you say?
Ah, introducing social pressure.
Exactly. And crucially, for trials 4, 5, and 6, the line pointed out as the group's choice was deliberately wrong.
Okay, so they're being told the group thinks the answer is X when it's clearly Y.
Precisely. And the researchers measured how often the participant went along with that incorrect group suggestion versus sticking to their own judgment. That was the measure of conformity.
And what happened? Did the cultures differ?
They did, significantly. The Temne, the collectivistic group, showed much higher rates of conformity. They were far more likely to give the incorrect answer suggested by their supposed group norm.
Okay, so they went with the group more often.
But the Inuit, the individualistic group, showed very low rates of conformity. Even lower than the Scottish comparison group, actually.
Wow. So they were more likely to ignore the group suggestion and give their own answer.
Exactly. They stuck to their own perception much more often, even when told most other Inuit disagreed.
That really does seem like a concrete behavioral outcome linked to those underlying cultural values we discussed.
It really does. It provides pretty compelling evidence for that link between the cultural dimension and conformity behavior.
Was there anything interesting about those in-transition groups? Did Western exposure make the Temne less conformist, or the Inuit more so?
Well, that's another really interesting finding. There was actually no significant difference within the groups.
Really?
Yeah. The traditional Temne conformed just as much as the transitional Temne, and the traditional Inuit were just as independent as the transitional Inuit.
Huh. So that exposure didn't seem to override the underlying cultural tendency.
It seems not, at least not in this context. Barry suggested that maybe when you explicitly remind people of their cultural identity, most Temne people say this, it makes that cultural norm particularly salient regardless of their individual experiences.
That makes sense. Like it activates that core cultural programming almost.
Something like that, yeah. So the study provides this really tangible link, showing how individualism and collectivism can shape behavior in measurable ways.
Okay, so this framework is clearly powerful. We see the differences in values. We see it potentially influencing behavior like conformity. But like with any model, we need to be careful, right? Our sources raise some cautions.
Oh, absolutely. It's crucial. Hofstede himself warned strongly against something called the ecological fallacy.
Ecological fallacy, what's that?
It's basically the mistake of assuming that findings at the group level, the cultural average, automatically apply to every single individual within that group.
Right. Just because Japan, say, scores high on collectivism doesn't mean every Japanese person is highly collectivistic.
Exactly. Or that any randomly chosen American will automatically be more individualistic than any randomly chosen Korean. People vary hugely within cultures. These dimensions are generalizations, descriptions of central tendencies, not blueprints for individuals.
So useful for understanding broad cultural patterns, but dangerous for making assumptions about individuals.
Precisely. And related to that is the risk of stereotype threat.
Stereotype threat.
Yeah, that's where if you make someone aware of a negative stereotype about their group, maybe based on these cultural dimensions, it can actually cause anxiety and make them underperform, sort of confirming the stereotype.
Oof, yeah. So using these dimensions to prejudge people can actually be harmful.
Definitely. We have to use them as tools for understanding potential differences, not as labels to stick on people.
Good point. What other caveats did these sources mention?
Well, it's worth remembering Hofstede's original research was done within a specific context, the workplace at IBM. And while these cultural values probably influence lots of areas of life, we can't assume that attitudes measured at work translate perfectly to, say, family life or friendships or political views.
The expression might be different in different spheres of life.
It could be, yeah. Also, the methodology itself using factor analysis on survey data has limitations.
So.
Factor analysis is a statistical technique to find underlying patterns, but interpreting what those patterns mean. Well, that involves some researcher judgment. Hofstede's team did work to cross-validate their findings, but it's still an interpretation.
So not purely objective data revealing itself.
Not entirely, no. And maybe the most important caveat
Yes.
is that this research is correlational, not causal. Meaning we can see a link and association between a culture being, say, collectivistic and its members tending to conform more. But we can't definitively say that collectivism causes the conformity.
Right. Other factors could be involved, or the relationship could be complex.
Exactly. Culture is incredibly complex. These dimensions are associated with behaviors, but they don't offer a simple A causes B explanation.
Okay, so lots of important things to keep in mind when using this model. Ecological fallacy, stereotype threat, context, interpretation, correlation, not causation.
But despite all those necessary cautions,
Yeah.
the sources generally conclude that Hofstede's dimensions, especially individualism, collectivism, are still incredibly valuable.
How so?
Well, they give us a shared language, a framework for talking about cultural differences in a more systematic way. And maybe most importantly, they help us challenge ethnocentrism.
Ethnocentrism, seeing our own culture as the default or the right way.
Exactly. Understanding these dimensions can help us realize that our way isn't the only way, and that other cultures might have very different but equally valid priorities and ways of organizing social life.
Opens up perspective.
It really does. It encourages more nuanced conversations.
Okay, so let's try and pull this all together then. This deep dive into individualism versus collectivism really shows us one major fault line along which societies differ, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. It affects so much personal goals, group dynamics, communication, even things like conformity, as we saw with Barry's study.
We've contrasted that focus on individual achievement and uniqueness in I cultures with the emphasis on group harmony and interdependence in we cultures.
Right, the directness versus the indirectness in communication, the guilt versus the shame, the value placed on self-reliance versus shared responsibility. It's this whole constellation of values that shifts.
Basically, that spectrum from a strong me focus to a strong we focus really shapes the social fabric.
It seems to, yes. And understanding that spectrum is, well, increasingly important in our super-connected world.
But as we've stressed, using these ideas thoughtfully is key. Avoiding those pitfalls, the stereotypes, the ecological fallacy is crucial.
Absolutely. Think of these dimensions as maybe starting points for inquiry, for understanding potential differences, not as definitive checklists for judging people or cultures.
A framework, not a straitjacket.
Well put.
So for you, our listener, here's a final thought to chew on. Thinking about your own life, your own observations, maybe travels or interactions with different communities. How do you see this individualism, collectivism dimension playing out? Are there subtle ways these tendencies might pop up in everyday situations, in decision-making, maybe even within different subgroups in your own society that we haven't even touched on today?
Yeah, where else might you notice these undercurrents? It's definitely something worth reflecting on as you navigate the world.